Thank you very much for joining us for the interview with Oxford Political Review. Introducing to our audience, Professor Faisal Devji is the Professor of Indian History at the University of Oxford, teaching at St. Anthony's College. Broadly, his research deals with intellectual history and the history of ideas, and he has used this framework to make critical interventions in modern Indian history, the idea of Pakistan and political Islam, where he links past and present in some unique ways, and this is demonstrated in his books Muslim Zion and the Impossible Indian, the latter being a book on Gandhi. Professor Faisal has joined us to discuss the prevailing political upheavals in India, where the nation witnesses the most intense form of polarization. And we are interested in knowing his views on how politics, religion, and interpretations on history intersect to produce today's politics. So, Professor Faisal, I'll be beginning with the first question, which is the use of historiography or the politics of using history has always been a powerful tool at the disposal of any ruling dispensation. With the BJP's rise, history writing is being redesigned to dovetail with what they call as rectifying the historical wrongs and rescuing history from the Marxist or the leftist interpretation. So we see the changes all over from ancient to modern day topics about Kashmir, foreign policy, or even Gandhi. And the present day history writing is being sold as an attempt towards desanctifying hitherto untouched facets that were beyond the purview of questions. And this also makes the whole narrative acquire a very democratic orientation. And this has also gained mass popularity. And as a historian, what kind of intervention would you suggest, especially at a time when India faces intense polarization?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually an interesting question. And I quite take the point about democratizing history, that every new dispensation that comes into power clearly wants to disturb the historical narrative of its predecessor, and sometimes even replace that with its own. But in the case of the BJP, and I should say of Hindutva more particularly, of course, there are various problems involved in this effort. One is perhaps made clear by the question, why does the BJP or Hindutva as a movement want simply to replace the historical narrative of its predecessor, in this case, Congress governments of various hues? Why simply accept the terms that have been given you and just try to people the pedestals once occupied by Gandhi or Nehru, etc., with your own figures? Of course, some of these figures are not their own figures. So there's a way in which, Gandhi has to still be there in some respects. And of course, Sardar Patel, who was a congressman, has been appropriated by the BJP. But this kind of iconoclasm, the renaming of cities, the renaming of junctions, etc., is, while understandable, also a bit superficial. In 2014, when this government first came to power, I had a conversation with someone very close to the government, a very senior figure, who asked me why it was that everyone seemed to be conversant with the Gandhis and the Nehrus of the Indian past, but not so much with thinkers of Hindu nationalism, who are undoubtedly very important, or some of them are undoubtedly very important. And at that point, my answer was, well, what Congress did is what post-colonial governments tended to do, which is they literally injected their history into the bloodstream of the Indian educational system. They produced editions, annotated editions, academic editions of texts, the more than 100 volumes of Gandhi's collected works, Nehru's selected works, etc., etc. And this is what made them such institutionalized figures. And the BJP or its predecessors in the Jansangh, etc., have never really made the effort to do this. I remember when I first in Mumbai went to find for purchase Savarkar's Essentials of Hindutva, I had to go to the old Hindu Mahasabha headquarters to get it. Even then, it wasn't very easy. It just wasn't available. But maybe that's just as it should be, because after all, for a very long time, Hindu nationalism has been a phenomenon defined by a secretive organization and a highly non-institutionalized in the public sense. How should I put it? Interface with Indian people more generally. Everyone knows who they are, but it's very difficult to actually find out what they are reading, what they are writing, until and unless you actually join. So you have this extraordinary situation of a very large, if you take the RSS, for instance, an enormous movement, yet one which is relatively unknown to the outside world, including among other Indians. And that seems to be the modus operandi of, or historically has been, the way in which Hindu nationalism functioned within Indian society, as something whose name was known very well, but whose internal thoughts and debates tended to be quite concealed. This has been the secret of its success. The problem, of course, is posed when the political party it supports has come to power. What happens to that level of secrecy? How do you bring up the functions of public government on the one hand and a semi-secretive clandestine organization on the other? It's not clandestine because it's illegal. It once upon a time was illegal, but clandestine out of principle. This is the way it works. And it also works through, if you will, a non-institutionalized, non-public form of mobilization, a social form, not central institutions or even government. And I suspect that this is where the true power and heritage of non-Congress or anti-Congress or Hindu nationalist historical consciousness resides. The moment you actually put it into the same place as the Congress had placed its great leaders, you betray it. And you see this not only with Hindutva. There have been efforts in the recent past to replace, say, Gandhi by Ambedkar among certain in caste politics, including leftist caste politics. And it's entirely understandable why there's the desire to do this, but surely it's a betrayal of Ambedkar himself to simply put him in a place vacated by his great rival, Gandhi. It makes no sense. It actually has Gandhi winning, even as he suffered. Similar problem that faces Hindutva in terms of how to present history to the Indian nation more broadly. And so I think the play of iconoclasm, of overturning someone's statues and putting your own in their place, while understandable, is both superficial and actually betrays the real power of Hindu nationalism as a form of thinking and as a form of practice.
Thank you for such an elaborate answer. And this brings me to the second question. Which is to do with individuals and history. As we all know, in India, having a certain interpretation of history makes one categorized immediately as a BJP or a Congress or a left-wing politics supporter. And it's very different from the Western notions because presently the tussle is more about tilting towards certain personalities. And as we all know, three figures, namely Nehru, Gandhi, and Savarkar, occupy a huge space in the political debates, having admirers and haters of extreme intensities. Is it possible to disseminate unbiased research on their lives and their actions, their politics, to promote a better informed debate in the society? Which also links to this larger question of why does it become extremely difficult to understand historical personalities or historical events in a critical perspective where both merits and demerits can be discussed at the same time? For instance, what you have been doing, if I get it right, in Muslim Zion, where Jinnah and Iqbal have been portrayed in a very different uh, perspective as against what traditional history writing in India and Pakistan has been about.
Yeah, it's I suppose my initial answer would be that one reason why there are so many sensitivities around these figures is because they have not yet been put into the past. They are not yet historical figures in some sense. There might be historical figures outside India or among non-Indians, but they are not in India and among many Indians. Uh, Now, that doesn't mean that the politics of their own day continues to live with us. I think it simply means that uh, we have been unable to accept our own history, uh, and that we continue to dress our contemporary problems in the raiment of the past. We insist on naming what we think and we do and what we debate with what these figures did in the 1920s or 30s or the early 1940s. And clearly there are some connections, but not as many as one would think. And this actually gives rise to an interesting question. Why should this be the case? Um, is it perhaps because we have not yet produced thinkers of such caliber in the subsequent period of independent Indian history? And if so, why not? Um, is it because uh, there's a problem with history itself as a form of consciousness? Uh, and I say this because, of course, as I'm sure you know, someone like Gandhi was very, very critical of historical consciousness and history as a form of thinking itself. Uh, he understood that history and historical consciousness uh, was one of the characteristics uh, that defined in European terms, in the European terms of those days, what it meant to be civilized and what it meant to be modern. And of course, in those terms, India, and in particular Hinduism, was seen as lacking history. Um, and so, partly because of this accusation of the lack of history or historical consciousness, a whole generation or two of Indian intellectuals were driven to historicize everything and to um, demonstrate that India actually had a history and be a historical consciousness, that it had historians. Um, and to do this, they had to bend various kinds of pre-modern texts like Puranas, etc., and turn them into a Europeanized form of history. Gandhi, of course, was against that altogether. He thought that this was just a form of this is just a way of buying into or accepting a European and colonial form of what it meant to be modern. And so he was also against historical consciousness because he realized, and this goes back to the question that you asked, that in modern times, uh, people's identities and collective identities was suddenly tied up with history in a way that they hadn't been in the past. So what we think of as the inheritance of the past that allows us to follow up the debates of the 1920s and even earlier with such ferocious attention. For Gandhi, that past was not a real past. That in the past, people hadn't, in fact, identified historically in this way. That people's identities had not been tied up with masjids and janmabhumis and various sites of this kind. So that the very debates and conflicts and controversies over history, in fact, showed India that it had become, if you will, Europeanized. It had become. So in this, I've put it in a rather convoluted way, I'm afraid, but what I'm trying to say is that already in the earlier 20th century, there was a consciousness among some Indian political figures, in fact, the main one, Gandhi, that history posed a problem in general because it was tied up with imperialism, it was tied up with a certain kind of modernity, and it posed a problem for Indians in particular because it redefined conflict. It's not like there was not conflict or there was never conflict, there was always conflict. But suddenly, from the 19th century, conflict took on a historical garb, which is why it became centered on things uh, like mosques and temples built at certain times, on birthplaces, on the victories and losses of people in the far past about whom we have very little knowledge. And the superficiality of this, of course, is shown by the fact that there is not that much interest in those periods apart from these controversies and personalities. No government really has, well, certainly not the present government, has invested very much effort into the historical study of the pre-colonial past or even the colonial past. It's almost as if our only access to our past is through conflict and controversy, and in no other way. And in that sense, this attachment or this access is false, as Gandhi realized. It is actually a way of imbibing a historical consciousness while betraying it at the same time.
Moving on to the politics of partition and the trajectory of Indian politics all the way to what we see happening today. My last two questions are on this specific issue. On my third question is, do you think that the time span between India's independence and the present day politics could be understood as a series of paradoxical events? I say it because during the time of the nationalist struggle, it was the progressive, or what we categorize as progressive Muslims. They rallied around Jinnah, and it was the Deobandis who stayed with the Congress. And in a way, support from prominent Muslim voices became quintessential for the Congress to put its case for a united India. There may be strong opinions on the politics of Deoband or what it has become on the other side of the border, say the AFPAC region. But definitely, the Deoband has played a very important role, or for that matter, the Ehrar, which metamorphosized into the Khatme Nabuwat movement. But not getting into that, Deoband remains very important in the freedom struggle. So, but now all these things, they look like a dream. They don't look like realities, and it is very difficult to believe that people could come together having different ideologies. They could come together for a common cause. So, what are your views on situating this part of history and look at the present day political debates and the communalization?
Yes, I guess. I mean, in one sense, of course, there is no debate. In part, there is no debate because certainly after partition, Muslims themselves are rarely, if ever, addressed. It's actually a fascinating situation that whether it is people who are defined as pro-Muslim or people who are defined as anti-Muslim, Muslims or the Muslim community tends to be referred to in the third person. So either whoever is doing the talking, it could be Muslims themselves who are doing the talking, right? On the one hand, you have these kinds of statements, Muslims are disloyal or they haven't done this or whatever. Or on the other hand, Muslims have contributed so much. They are spoken of in the third person. There is never any direct conversation. I find that very interesting is it due to the fact that after partition, Muslims ceased to have a political identity, and therefore could not really be addressed? Who would you be talking to politically? They only come together in a negative form in processes of marginalization, let's say, or occasional discrimination. So the debate is a non-debate in a sense because it occurs indirectly. Muslims themselves are rarely, if ever, part of that conversation subject. Now, this is not true of Hindus who can be addressed, and in part because they are seen as having some kind of political identity. In some ways, this reminds me of what Gandhi used to say about communalism. He saw the making of communal interests as being to the establishment of liberalism in a broad manner. Because the colonial state was alienated by non-Indians, had to justify itself in part by proclaiming its neutrality to third party. It made its weakness, which was its alienness, into an advantage by saying that we are the only people who are capable of the various conflicts and controversies that bedevil India and Indian society. And by setting itself up as a neutral third party, of course, it made Hindus and Muslims, as well as upper and lower castes or different kinds of regional identities, into interest groups who are only given meaning through the state as a neutral third party. This is the way in which a liberal state behaves. Gandhi, of course, was very critical of this because he thought it separated Indians out and made them into interest groups in the first place, whose relations, therefore, had to be mediated by the state and through the state. From then on, they could not speak to each other. They had to go through the state. Now, you recall, even in the controversy over the Babri Masjid, while it was still standing, when Narasimha Rao was prime minister, there was never or rarely any direct conversation between any groups of Hindus or Muslims. Everything had to go through the state. Because if people spoke to each other directly, that, of course, would mean a crisis for the state and its own form of legitimacy. So Gandhi had wanted Indians to bypass the state and to speak directly with one another. And I've gone through this rather lengthy description of Gandhi's views of the colonial state as a form of the liberal state in order to show how and why it might be that Muslims cannot be part of the conversation, for instance, after partition. Right? The other part has to do with a loss of political identity, and there is a scattering in various ways. Now, the thing about the role that Muslims and the Islamic past plays in the Hindu nationalist imagination, which I want to add here, which I think is interesting, is it is almost as if this past can only be recovered through the figure of Islam or the figure of the Muslim and the Muslim past. So whether it is the Babri Masjid Ram Janmabhoomi controversy, or it is Kashi or Mathura, or anything else, street names in Delhi, Aurangzeb, the former Aurangzeb, like Allahabad, UP. It is almost as if you can only get access to the pre-Muslim past through the Muslim past, rather than seeing this simply as a kind of opportunistic way of attacking Muslims, which is how it's normally seen, and I'm sure there is some reality in there. the passions evoked by these name changes and these controversies over histories, I think, go beyond mere opportunism. Uh, I think they have to do with the fact that the pre-Muslim past, let's say, indeed even the pre-colonial past, seems to have become inaccessible. And it can only be accessed through the figure of the Muslims. So the rivalry or the enmity or the hostility, the conflict that is at the heart of these various controversies is at the same time a relationship of intimacy and possible friendship, as Gandhi might have seen it. Uh, Somehow you can only get to Lord Rama's birthplace through the figure of the mosque. What does that mean? Uh, Especially in a situation where, as with Banaras, the Aurangzeb mosque is very clearly built on the site of a temple, which moved to accommodate. But that is that keeps, it's mentioned as a site of contestation. And of course, it is a site of contestation, but it has never been the subject of a huge controversy like the Babri Masjid has been. A situation where it wasn't clear if there was any temple there. There was nothing you could draw upon. And so the funny thing for me is, like, why would you neglect Mathura or Kashi, which are clearly signs of Muslim iconoclasm, to go for a site and a subject which has very little demonstrable historical proof behind it? And I suspect the answer in part has to do with this, with the attempt to recover a pre-colonial or a pre-Muslim or a Hindu past that has become accessible, and which you can only gain access to through the figure of the Muslim or the Muslim past. Uh, so these conflicts of history are as much about the intertwinement and the intimacy that exists between Hindus and Muslims historically and in the present, as about their alienation from each other or their separation. So it's a slightly different logic than the one I was speaking of earlier, which had to do with mediation. The state, the colonial state, and then the Indian state had been put in the middle to manage the relations between Hindus and Muslims, between different caste groups, etc., and therefore preventing their direct converse, their direct conversation. That's one thing that I wanted to stress. The other thing is precisely this: the violent intimacy, which suggests the partial failure of that liberal project of dividing up Hindus and Muslims and different caste groups, etc., to be mediated only by the state. So there are two sides of this logic, I think. And neither of these sides can be reduced purely to stratagem and to opportunism and to political gerrymandering and to tactics. There is obviously there is some of that going on, but there is an appeal to something much deeper than that, which I think gives shape to the historical controversies, or the way in which the controversies have come to be defined since the 19th century by history and not by anything else. When you look at Hindu-Muslim conflicts in the Mughal period, let's say, they tend not to be about history. They tend to be about other kinds of things. As far as I can tell, I'm not a Mughal historian. So when we talk about history and historical consciousness and the shape that conflicts take today, we need to be careful to historicize that story, and to get at least these two sides of it that I've tried to lay out.
And this also brings me to the last question, and linking it with the argument you made that Muslim identity was invoked in negative forms. I can also add by saying that even secularism, the whole debate, discourse on secularism, has been invoked in negative forms, because whenever there is a communal riot, people who want to mend the fences, they'll go back to abstractions like Sufism or Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb or all these transactionalist episodes of a Muslim businessman or a Hindu client or vice versa. Now, this remains a trap which we cannot get out of. And based on this, I have this question on the present politics, which is about the NRC or the constitutional, the whole bill and the controversy surrounding the bill on who becomes a citizen and who's not. How do you see the state of Hindu-Muslim relationship at the present? Again, it's a broad generalization. We cannot speak on the behalf of entire India or based on what happened in Delhi, but given the polarization, given the social media discussions, news debates, and a general feeling which has gradually seeped into the Indian population, Indian citizens, based on what we are witnessing today, is it possible to define a sort of an evolutionary trajectory over the last 40, 50, 60, or these 7 decades? And can we say something about the present politics as being a sort of a stepping stone to look into the future? Can we link past, present, and future in a certain way? If I could request your views on this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, of course, that these rather embarrassing invocations of Ganga, Jamni, Tehzeeb, and, they're really cringeworthy. And I wish people would stop making them. I understand why people need to do that. Every time there's a riot or there's a lynching or there will be condemnation, there will be defensiveness, and there will also be these memes or these anecdotes of people getting along that are produced. And what I wanted to suggest in my answer to your previous question was, let's actually be careful about this idea of people getting along so well. Because sometimes at the very heart of violence lies intimacy, which is one of the things I was trying to say in my previous answer, that the inseparability of the Hindu and Muslim is what makes the violence possible. It also, in Gandhi's view, makes non-violence possible. So there's a fundamental ambiguity there. And what Gandhi wanted to do is try to, as it were, make non-violent relations possible. But what someone like Jinnah wanted to do, he recognized the same issue, that the problem was not that Hindus and Muslims were set against each other, but that their setting, the fact that they were set against each other derived from their intimacy, derived from the fact that they were too close to each other. And what Jinnah wanted to do with partition is to separate them out. And he often used to use, being the lawyer that he was, this idea of the paternal inheritance that needed to be divided, the batwara, right, of the paternal house. The brothers have quarreled and you need to separate them so that they can become friends. I mean, so Jinnah's sort of standard issue argument was that what we need to do is that we have two feuding brothers. The fact that they're fighting and fighting so vehemently shows you that they are brothers. Only brothers fight like this with each other. They are not strangers. So what he wanted to do is to transform the brothers into friends. And he thought he could only do that by some kind of what eventually became the partition of India. Of course, he was wrong. It didn't happen. It indeed made things even worse. Gandhi was also interested in friendship, but he was unwilling to deny brotherhood either. Both men realized that the problem was the closeness and the intimacy. The problem was the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, in other words, which is also what makes Hindu nationalism so keen on going through Muslim history to get to the pre-Muslim past, because it realizes how intertwined these histories are. If you were to look at Savarkar's Essentials of Hindutva, that is exactly what he says as well. That these terms, he said, they've crept into the hearts of our Harimandirs, like thieves. Persian words, Arabic words, concepts, and they've become part of Hinduism. How do you actually rip them out without damaging Hinduism itself? So even Savarkar understands this. He realizes this. So all of which is to say that the invocations of friendship and intimacy, they're correct in many respects, but we should not cease to be suspicious of them as well. That the problem comes from there as much, perhaps, as the solution might. Now, in terms of Muslim politics, I can't help thinking. You asking me to think about the past 70 years and whether there's a trajectory. Let me offer the possibility of an alternative trajectory. Right? So before partition, Congress was certainly by far the largest political party in India, but it had a significant opposition. The Muslim League was the most significant opposition party, but it was not the only one, and it allied itself occasionally with others. And that included for the Hindu Mahasabha, came the RS. If you look at Savarkar's letters, you see this. In fact, Savarkar and Ambedkar stood together against Congress to mark a day of deliverance when Congress governments went out of power in 1939. Now, Jinnah is the one who withdrew from these forms of alliance making when he opted for Pakistan. And Ambedkar accused him of sacrificing the lower caste, for instance, to make a deal between upper caste Hindus and upper caste Muslims. Right? When India becomes independent, Maulana Azad harangues Muslims in the Jamna Masjid in Delhi, accuses them of not having supported him personally, and urges them to join the Congress. Gandhi is against this. Gandhi says to Muslims, look, the Congress is understandably suspicious of your motives now that partition has happened. You should not join under compulsion, nor should you join just as the servants of the Congress. You have to join with self-respect. You have something to contribute, but you also have your own interests to protect. He was all for Muslims staying out of the Congress for a while. And remember, this same Gandhi had congratulated Jinnah for coming together with Savarkar and Ambedkar to form an opposition to Congress because he understood its political consequences for India's democracy. Democracy requires an opposition to exist. Once upon a time, the Muslim League was part of that opposition. After independence, it could not be. It became a minor party in the south of India, where it still exists. In the rest of India, the Muslim League was wound up and Muslims joined the Congress, thus giving rise to a new debate which had to do with vote bank politics and appeasement, the Hindu nationalist debate or accusation against Congress. This held back India's democratization, precisely because after independence, there was nothing to rival Congress. It had many different views, points of views within it, this kind of big tent that Congress had become, as we know. But perhaps Gandhi was right when he suggested in 1947 that Congress should dissolve itself because its job was done. And it should dissolve itself and allow different political parties to come to the fore to reconstitute India as a democratic nation state. So my way of reimagining a trajectory for India would be to suggest, what if Azad was wrong and Gandhi was right? What if India's democratic experiment, which is one of the most significant experiments in world history of democracy, had started off with a viable set of opposition parties, not just regional parties. We wouldn't have had to wait until 2014 or before, when Mr. Vajpayee first formed his government, or immediately after the emergency when the Janata Dal first formed a non-Congress government, for this to happen. And I would like also to suggest that when L.K. Advani and Jaswant Singh were pilloried over their remarks, Advani's remarks on Jinnah when he went to Karachi on the one hand, and Jaswant Singh's biography of Jinnah, they might have been for these acts, but they somehow seem to have understood the longer-term relations between Hindu nationalism and, if you will, Muslim nationalism. I'm not saying this in a polemical way. I'm saying this to signal that there was a democratic experiment going on in India even before independence. It was that experiment that was cut off by 1947 and the founding of Pakistan and the coming to power of a enormously hegemonic party like Congress. That is the trajectory that was an interrupted one in India's modern history, and might help us to think about that history differently if we think about what was cut off at 1947. Many things were. The border, of course, was the country itself was cut. But this trajectory, an alternative, if you will, right-wing or conservative trajectory of Indian democratization, was also cut off from the new history that was being formed of independent India. And if we take that story seriously, then perhaps we might think about contemporary politics seriously as well. You mentioned Deoband. In many respects, Deoband, as a conservative group of clerics, is much more attuned to the BJP ideologically than it is the Congress, even though historically, of course, it has been pro-Congress. And these sorts of rearrangements could be made possible under a different kind of, in a different kind of political context. And occasionally, even the BJP has tried to make that happen. It has appealed to certain conservative Muslim forces. But strangely, it has also appealed to certain leftist or liberal Muslim forces, for instance, on the Triple Talaq judgment. So it's both conscious of this history that has been cut off that I was just describing earlier, and yet at the same time, it has lumped in the conservative Muslims of the Congress and tried to go for the, if you will, whatever you would call them, the leftists or the progressive ones. Neither strategy is going to work because they're incompatible, those two strategies. But whether they work or not, the point I want to make is that all of these events actually remind us of the road not taken or the road half built, if you will. And it might be interesting to look at that road and see if it can be built, if different kinds of alliances can be made to make a new politics possible. The BJP is not going anywhere, it's here to stay. The Muslim community, as I started out by saying in response to your first question, in a way does not exist. It has no political existence. It has only a negative existence. It can only come to exist in fragments, in its parts. So, for instance, if you're thinking of caste politics, it is only by actually splitting up the Muslim community that a caste alliance becomes possible. You cannot have an alliance between Muslims as a community and Dalits as a caste. That is a foolhardy desire. It's an unworkable desire because it's putting two very different things together opportunistically. A true caste alliance would be Muslim law and Dalits. That would leave the Muslim upper caste and the conservative elements to gravitate towards other kinds of parties, like the BJP or others, and the liberals to go to Congress, and the leftists to go to the communists, etc. That is one way in which you can think about the rebuilding of Indian party politics and democracy in a non-communal way. None of these people would cease being Hindus or Muslims or Christians or whoever they are, Sikhs and Jains and Parsis, but it would really reshape what we mean by politics and further its democratic credentials. Whether that is possible or not is, of course, remains the big question. An opening might be made with caste politics if it happens under the conditions I have just described to you. And that opening then could be widened because it is clear that there will be Muslims, and there have been Muslims who have voted for the BJP, and there will always be Muslims who will vote for Congress and for regional parties. They do that anyway. The problem in the present is that they've been negatively pushed towards, in national elections, voting for one rather than the other. But that kind of tactical voting does not build true alliances. It does not build a true set of mutual interests. It remains opportunistic. But this can be said about Indian politics, much of Indian politics in general, which tends to hold people hostages out of fear rather than out of inclination or desire. So it might be entirely utopian for me to suggest this possibility, but I would like to locate it nevertheless in what I described as that road that was either cut off or only half built, an alternative road to Indian democracy.
Thank you very much for being with us and giving such elaborate answers to all the questions I asked. And we hope we can find better answers in the nuances you delved into, because it is also the case where some of the best answers, some of the best explanations can be found in these nuances rather than the polarizations which unfortunately characterize the present. Thank you very much for being with us, Professor Faisal.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.